I gifted my parents a luxury seaside mansion for their 50th wedding anniversary. It was supposed to be a surprise celebration of their lifelong sacrifices. When I finally arrived at the property, I found my mother crying and my father trembling on the manicured front lawn. My husband and his family had completely taken over the property. My mother-in-law stepped toward my mother, pointing a manicured finger toward the street, and told her to get out. That is when I stepped out of my car, and a heavy silence fell over the entire yard. The coastal breeze of Hilton Head Island usually brought me peace, but today it carried a thick tension that made my blood boil. I pulled my car into the sprawling circular driveway of the $400,000 coastal home I had purchased in secret. The pristine white columns and sweeping ocean views were meant to be a sanctuary for my parents, Thomas and Evelyn. They had spent 30 years working grueling shifts in Atlanta just to give me a chance at a corporate career. Instead of enjoying their retirement, they were standing on the perfectly cut grass, clutching black plastic trash bags. My father, a proud man who never asked anyone for a single favor in his entire life, looked utterly defeated. His hands were shaking as he tried to gather their scattered belongings from the driveway. My mother stood beside him, wiping tears from her cheeks. Standing on the wraparound porch, looking down at them like they were unwanted pests, was my husband Marcus, along with his mother Barbara and his sister-in-law Sarah. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs wearing a designer sundress and casually sipping a mimosa. She held a silver picture frame in her other hand. I recognized it immediately. It was the 50th anniversary portrait I had custom ordered for my parents. With a lazy smirk, Sarah tossed the heavy frame off the porch. It hit the stone walkway, and the glass shattered completely. My mother flinched at the sound. Sarah crossed her arms and leaned against the wooden railing. "This is a gated community, Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of wealthy entitlement that always made my skin crawl. "This is not the gritty East Atlanta neighborhood you are used to. Marcus bought this beautiful house for his real family. You need to gather your trash and leave before I call the neighborhood watch to have you escorted out." She took another slow sip of her drink, looking thoroughly entertained by my parents' humiliation. Barbara stood right behind Sarah, nodding in agreement. My mother-in-law had always carried herself like a modern aristocrat, looking down her nose at anyone who did not match her elite social circles. She had spent my entire marriage making subtle comments about my working-class background. Now she was standing on the porch of a home I bought, allowing a white woman to threaten my parents with the police. I turned off the engine and stepped out of my vehicle. I did not scream. I did not run or cause a scene. I had spent years working as a forensic accountant, dismantling corporate fraud and stripping powerful men of their assets. I knew exactly how to weaponize my anger. I walked slowly up the stone path, the crunch of my designer heels signaling my arrival. The smug smile vanished from Sarah immediately. Barbara took a sudden step backward, clutching her pearl necklace. I did not even look at them. I kept my eyes locked directly on the man hiding behind his mother. Marcus was a 35-year-old cosmetic dentist who spent more time polishing his image than working on his practice. He had always presented himself as the ultimate provider, the wealthy husband taking care of his lucky wife. Right now, he looked like a terrified child. I knelt down and carefully picked up the broken picture frame from the stones. I brushed the shards of glass away from my parents' smiling faces and handed the portrait to my father. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out the keys to my rental vehicle. I pressed them into his calloused hands. "Take Mom to the Ritz-Carlton down the road," I told him softly. "I booked the presidential suite for you both. Go relax and order whatever you want. I will handle taking out the trash here." Sarah laughed, a harsh grating sound that broke the tension. "The Ritz," she mocked, pulling out her smartphone. "Are you planning to use Marcus and his credit cards to pay for that suite? Because we had him cancel all your accounts this morning, you gold digger. You do not have a single dime to your name right now." I ignored her completely and continued staring at Marcus. He finally stepped out from behind his mother, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. He could not even look my parents in the eye. Chloe, you have to understand. He stammered, his voice lacking all its usual arrogance. My mother has been dealing with high blood pressure lately. Her doctor said she desperately needed the sea air to recover. We used our joint savings account to buy this place, so technically it is half mine anyway. I am the man of the house, and I had to make an executive decision for my family. I tilted my head and let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my work phone, bringing up the financial documents I had secured just moments before arriving. You used our joint savings account to buy this house, I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. That is a very funny story, Marcus, because I checked that specific bank account this morning and the balance is completely empty. You took everything we had saved together and it certainly did not pay for this property at all. Marcus physically recoiled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound materialized. That is when his mother decided to insert herself. Barbara marched down the wooden steps, her pearl necklace bouncing. She positioned herself in front of her son, acting like a human shield. "Do not you dare speak to my son with that tone," she snapped. Her voice echoed harshly across the lawn. "You should be thanking God that a man of his stature even looked your way. Marcus is a respected cosmetic dentist and the sole provider for your household. Without his income, you would be living in some cramped apartment balancing spreadsheets for minimum wage. You are nothing but a mediocre bookkeeper, Chloe. You have absolutely no right to question how he allocates his money." I stared at my mother-in-law. She had spent the last 4 years treating my career as a little hobby. She had no idea that my bookkeeping involved restructuring multi-million-dollar corporate debt portfolios. Before I could address Barbara, Sarah sashayed down the steps. Sarah adjusted her designer sunglasses and looked me up and down with blatant disgust. Her gaze lingered critically on my professional locks before shifting to evaluate my parents. "Honestly, Chloe," Sarah sneered, folding her arms across her chest. "Look at them." She gestured lazily toward my mother and father. "Your mother is wearing a cardigan that looks like it came from a discount bin. Your father is wearing scuffed work boots to a coastal estate. You people do not fit the aesthetic of this neighborhood. We are trying to maintain a certain standard here. You and your family drag his image down entirely." My father tightened his grip on his trash bags. My mother looked down at her clothes, shame coloring her cheeks. That reaction ignited a cold, calculated fury deep inside my chest. I did not raise my voice or give them the angry reaction they were desperately trying to provoke. Emotion was a weakness in hostile negotiations, and I was currently negotiating the permanent end of my marriage. I turned my back on Barbara and Sarah completely. I walked over to my father and reached into my handbag. I pulled out the key fob for the luxury vehicle I rented at the airport. I placed it firmly into his calloused palm. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice gentle but commanding, "I want you to take Mom and drive straight to the Ritz-Carlton downtown. I booked the presidential suite for the entire weekend. The valet is expecting you, and all the expenses are fully covered by me. Go get a massage and just relax." My father looked at the key fob and then up at me, his eyes filled with worry. "Chloe, we cannot leave you here alone with these hostile people," he protested softly. "What about the house and our anniversary?" I offered him a reassuring smile and squeezed his shoulder firmly. "Do not worry about this property, Dad. Go enjoy your anniversary with Mom. I am going to stay right here and handle the trash removal." I made direct eye contact with Sarah as I delivered that final line. The implication landed exactly as intended. Sarah gasped loudly, her face flushing a deep, angry red. Barbara clutched her pearls tighter as if I had physically assaulted her. "The Ritz-Carlton," Sarah barked, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh. She pulled her smartphone out of her pocket and waved it like a weapon. "Do you really think you are sending anyone to a luxury hotel today?" She stepped closer, pointing her phone directly at my face. "I knew you would try to pull a stunt like this, so I gave Marcus a little advice this morning. I had him call the bank and cancel every single credit card with your name on it. You are completely cut off, you pathetic gold digger. You do not have a single penny to your name right now. You cannot even afford a cheap motel room, let alone the presidential suite. Marcus finally peeked out from behind his mother, looking suddenly emboldened by Sarah. "I had to do it, Chloe," he muttered, trying to sound authoritative. "I cannot let you drain my hard-earned money to fund your parents' lavish lifestyle." I stood still, the ocean breeze rustling the palm trees behind me. I did not reach for my wallet to check my cards. I did not panic. Instead, I waited. I knew what was about to happen because I had planned every step of this confrontation. Right on cue, a sharp chime broke the tense silence. It was not Sarah and her phone. The sound came from the device resting in my own hand. I lifted my phone to my waiting face. The notification illuminating the dark screen was not an alert from a credit card company about a declined transaction. It was a priority alert from the federal banking monitor system I used for my corporate debt restructuring clients. I had secretly set up a specialized tracking algorithm for my husband and his business accounts exactly 2 weeks ago. I looked up from the glowing screen, my eyes locking directly onto Marcus. My smile widened, finally reaching my eyes this time. "That is absolutely fascinating financial advice, Sarah," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the lawn. "However, you might want to give Marcus some very serious legal advice next." I stepped forward, forcing Barbara to stumble back a few inches. I held the phone up so Marcus could clearly read the bold red text illuminating the screen in my hand. "Your credit cards do not matter to me, Marcus," I stated, watching the color drain from his terrified face. "Because the Internal Revenue Service just placed a massive federal freeze on your entire dental clinic operating account right now. Every single dollar you claim to have earned is currently locked under a federal tax evasion investigation." The Ritz-Carlton presidential suite door clicked shut behind us, muting the busy corridor. My mother dropped her purse onto the marble entryway. She surveyed the living space, her eyes darting from the chandeliers to the windows overlooking the crashing waves. My father stood rigidly on the Persian rug, clutching his plastic trash bags. He looked completely out of place. He cleared his heavy throat loudly, the hollow sound echoing across the cavernous room. "Chloe, we cannot stay here," my father said, voice thick with anxiety. "This place costs more for one night than I made in a month at the factory. Marcus will ruin you in court for this. We can just drive back to Atlanta." I took the plastic bags from his tense grip, setting them behind a velvet sofa. I guided my parents to the plush seating area, waiting until they sat down before taking the armchair opposite them. I needed them to understand who they were dealing with, and more importantly, who I had become while living under Barbara and arrogant Marcus. "Marcus is not going to do anything to me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I am not paying for this room with his money or his credit cards. I am paying for it with my own money." My mother twisted the wedding band on her finger. "Barbara said you are just a bookkeeper, Chloe. A bookkeeper cannot afford a suite like this. You do not need to go into massive debt just to protect our pride." I leaned forward, gently resting my elbows on my knees. "I am not a bookkeeper, Mom." I let Barbara and Marcus believe that because it fed their bloated egos. "I am a senior forensic accountant for a massive corporate restructuring firm here. I track down offshore accounts for billionaires. I dismantle fraudulent shell companies. I have spent the last decade building my very own private real estate portfolio under a blind trust." My parents stared at me in stunned silence. The ocean waves crashed against the beach below, providing the only sound in the room. "Your real estate portfolio," my father repeated softly, struggling to process the incredible information. "How much money are we actually talking about?" $15 million, I stated clearly, watching their jaws drop. "That coastal mansion belongs entirely to my trust. I bought it in cash 3 weeks ago. His name is not on a single deed or utility bill. He does not even own the grass he was standing on." My mother shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "I do not understand. If you have all this money, why did you let him treat you like a servant? Why let his family humiliate us both for years?" The question stung, but it was fair. I slowly walked over to the massive window. "Because Marcus is deeply insecure," I explained. "When we got married, I told him I wanted to make partner. He laughed in my face. He told me cosmetic dentistry was a real career and moving numbers was just busy work. Whenever I had a victory at the office, he picked a fight to ruin the evening." I realized quickly the only possible way to survive my marriage was to play the mediocre wife while he played the high society breadwinner. I turned back to face them. I let him believe he was the sole provider. I let Barbara think I was just a charity case. While they spent their time climbing the social ladder and buying luxury cars on credit, I built a permanent fortress. I protected my assets, and I protected both of you. My father let out a long, heavy breath, leaning against the velvet cushions. The tension was finally leaving his shoulders. "So that mansion really was for our anniversary?" he asked, a small smile forming on his lips. "It is completely yours," I promised him. "I am transferring the deed into a secure generational trust under your names next week. Barbara and Sarah will be forcibly evicted the second my legal team finishes drafting the trespassing notices. You will never have to deal with those toxic women again." My mother finally smiled, reaching out to squeeze my father's hand. "I cannot believe it," she whispered. "We are safe. You really thought of everything, Chloe." "I always secure my positions," I said, picking up my smartphone. "I want to show you exactly how secure we are. I am transferring $100,000 into your personal checking account right now, so you can go buy new clothes for the weekend." I opened my secure banking application, navigating directly to the joint savings account I shared with Marcus. This was where I deposited a small portion of my monthly salary to maintain the illusion of my meager bookkeeping wages. It was supposed to hold exactly $250,000 money we had supposedly saved up over the last 5 years for emergencies. I stared at the screen, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The application refreshed, but the numbers remained exactly the same. The balance displayed was $50,000. I blinked, tapping the screen aggressively to reload the server data. The numbers did not change. I navigated quickly to the recent transaction history, my eyes scanning the ledger. There it was, sitting at the top of the screen. 2 days ago, a single wire transfer had been initiated from his laptop. He moved exactly $200,000 out of our joint savings account. The money had not been transferred to his dental clinic. It had not been moved to his personal checking account. It had been wired to an external, unrecognized routing number. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. Marcus was arrogant, but completely financially illiterate. He barely knew how to balance his own clinic payroll. He would never initiate a massive wire transfer without an urgent reason. Where did all the missing money go? The question of where the money vanished burned in my mind all weekend, but Monday morning arrived with a strict demand for cold professionalism. I walked into the sleek glass and steel lobby of Vanguard Financial Group in downtown Atlanta, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The towering skyscraper was a fortress of wealth management and corporate auditing, a place where multi-million-dollar decisions were made daily. I flashed my platinum access badge at the security desk and made my way toward the private executive elevators. My mind was already racing through the preliminary tracking algorithms I had deployed to trace Marcus's missing $200,000. I knew the stolen money had not simply vanished into thin air, because digital currency always leaves a footprint for those who know exactly where to look. Before the heavy elevator doors could slide shut, a shrill voice echoed loudly across the corporate lobby. "There she is!" Sarah yelled, pointing a manicured finger directly in my direction. She marched through the heavy revolving glass doors with Barbara trailing closely behind her. They both looked entirely out of place in the sterile and professional corporate environment. Barbara was wearing a ridiculously oversized sun hat and clutching a brightly colored designer handbag, like a physical shield, while Sarah was dressed in a pristine white tennis skirt and a pink cashmere sweater tied loosely around her neck. They bypassed the mandatory visitor check-in desk, completely blatantly ignoring the polite protests of the young front desk receptionist. They stormed directly toward my private elevator bay, their faces twisted into identical expressions of arrogant determination and unchecked entitlement. I stepped out of the elevator cab, refusing to let them cause a massive public scene inside the executive suite upstairs. "What exactly are you doing here?" I asked them, keeping my voice incredibly low and perfectly controlled. "You are actively trespassing in a highly secure corporate building right now." Barbara scoffed loudly, immediately drawing the curious attention of several passing investment bankers. "We are here to put a permanent end to your little temper tantrum," she announced proudly, rummaging aggressively through her oversized designer bag. "My son Marcus is far too kind-hearted to deal with a bitter and ungrateful woman like you, so Sarah and I are taking over." She pulled out a thick stack of printed legal documents and shoved them violently toward my chest. "This is a legally binding quitclaim deed. You are going to sign it right now and transfer the deed of that beautiful coastal house directly into my son's name. If you sign it quietly, Marcus might be generous enough to avoid dragging you through a very messy and highly public divorce." I did not even bother to look at the threatening papers in her hand. The sheer blinding audacity of their delusional demand was almost comical. They genuinely believed they could march right into my professional place of business, publicly humiliate me in front of my respected colleagues, and successfully steal a $15 million property with a freshly printed piece of paper. "I am absolutely not signing anything today," I stated flatly while maintaining intense and direct eye contact with my mother-in-law. "And you both need to leave this building immediately before I have you forcibly escorted out." Sarah let out a loud, dramatic gasp, placing a delicate hand over her chest in perfectly feigned outrage. She immediately pivoted to her absolute favorite manipulation tactic, weaponizing her perceived privilege and instantly assuming the helpless role of the victim. "Excuse me," Sarah shouted loudly, her whining voice reaching a piercing pitch that forced several busy employees to stop and stare. "You do not get to threaten us. You are just a glorified secretary in this building. I know exactly how to handle aggressive people like you." She turned sharply toward the main security desk, waving her arms frantically to get the immediate attention of the armed guards. "Security! I need security over here right now. This crazy woman is harassing us and making me feel physically unsafe. I want her removed from the lobby immediately." The head of security, a burly man named Davis, who politely greeted me every single morning, exchanged a highly confused look with his uniformed partner. He started walking slowly toward us, his right hand resting cautiously on his tactical radio. Sarah smirked directly at me, crossing her arms triumphantly across her chest. "You are about to lose your little bookkeeping job, Chloe. Let us see exactly how you afford your fancy luxury hotel suites when you are completely unemployed and facing a massive legal lawsuit." The curious crowd in the corporate lobby had significantly thickened, excited whispers rippling rapidly through the gathered executives. Before Security Chief Davis could even reach our tense group, the private executive elevator chimed softly directly behind me. The polished silver doors slid open smoothly, and out stepped Jonathan Sterling. Jonathan was the brilliant chief executive officer of Vanguard Financial Group, a powerful man whose valuable time was billed at $5,000 an hour. He was holding a sleek black leather folder. The entire busy lobby fell instantly silent. Even oblivious Sarah seemed to sense the immense shift in power, her complaining mouth snapping shut as Jonathan bypassed the confused security team and walked directly to my side. He did not look angry. He looked entirely focused on me, treating me with professional respect. "Good morning, Chloe," Jonathan said, handing me the leather folder. "The forensic audit team worked through the weekend. The data extraction is complete, and the tracking is clear. You were right about the offshore routing." I took the folder. "Thank you, Jonathan," I replied. I turned back to Barbara, who was staring in absolute shock. I flipped the folder open. "You want the coastal house? Fine. Ask Sarah exactly why her completely bankrupt father suddenly received a massive transfer of $200,000 directly from your son's dental clinic payroll account." Barbara stared at the open file, the color rapidly draining from her perfectly contoured face. The heavy stack of quitclaim documents slipped from her trembling fingers, scattering across the polished marble floor of the lobby. Sarah let out a strangled gasp, her eyes darting frantically between my calm expression and the damning financial evidence resting in my hands. The security guards, who had finally reached our position, did not need to be instructed twice. Jonathan gave them a curt nod, and Davis immediately stepped between me and my stunned in-laws. He firmly directed Barbara and Sarah toward the revolving doors, ignoring their sudden, humiliated silence. I turned on my heel and followed Jonathan into the private elevator, leaving them to pick up their worthless papers from the floor. 10 hours later, the adrenaline of the morning had completely settled into a cold, calculated focus. I packed my laptop into my leather briefcase and rode the elevator down to the executive parking garage beneath the Vanguard Financial Building. The subterranean level was dimly lit and echoed with the hum of ventilation fans. My footsteps echoed against the concrete as I approached my reserved parking space. I unlocked my vehicle, the headlights flashing briefly in the dim light. Before I could even reach the driver's side door handle, a figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. It was Marcus. His designer suit jacket was heavily wrinkled, his tie was loosened, and his normally pristine hair was an absolute mess. He had clearly been waiting in the dark for hours. "You think you are so incredibly smart, do you not?" Marcus snarled, his voice echoing violently through the empty parking garage. He closed the distance between us, his chest heaving with uncontrolled anger. "You humiliated my mother in front of half the financial district today. You made my sister-in-law look like a common criminal. Who do you think you are, Chloe? You hid millions of dollars from your own husband for years, and now you have the absolute audacity to act like you hold the moral high ground." I did not back away. I leaned casually against the door of my car, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched him throw his tantrum with the detached interest of a scientist observing a predictable lab rat. "I hid my money to survive your suffocating ego, Marcus," I replied evenly. "And considering you just drained our entire joint savings account to fund a bankrupt construction company, I would say my financial instincts were absolutely flawless." Marcus scoffed loudly, throwing his hands up in the air as if he were dealing with a deeply unreasonable child. He immediately launched into the exact same manipulative gaslighting tactics he had utilized for the last 5 years of our marriage. "You are twisting the facts to fit your ridiculous victim narrative," he shouted, stepping even closer. "I did not steal our money. I made a highly strategic bridge loan to Sarah's father. His commercial construction firm was facing a temporary liquidity crisis. He secured a massive government contract, and he just needed the operating capital to cover initial material costs. I secured a guaranteed 30% return on that investment. But you would not understand that, would you? You are too narrow-minded to understand high-level equity lending. I was trying to double our savings so we could finally live the lifestyle I actually deserve. You are a cosmetic dentist who struggles to read a basic profit and loss statement," I stated flatly, cutting through his delusion. "You did not execute a strategic bridge loan. You wired $200,000 of marital assets into an unsecured failing business account without consulting me. Furthermore, you routed that money directly through your dental clinic's corporate payroll account to hide the transaction from our personal bank statements. That is not equity lending, Marcus. That is federal wire fraud and blatant corporate embezzlement." The clinical accuracy of my assessment made him falter, but his arrogance quickly swallowed his hesitation. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his eyes wide with malicious intent. "You listen to me very carefully," he threatened, lowering his voice into a dangerous growl. "I am going to destroy you in divorce court. You think you can hide $15 million in a blind trust and just walk away clean. I am your legal husband. I am entitled to half of everything you built during this marriage. I will hire the most ruthless litigators in Atlanta. I will subpoena every single one of your offshore accounts. I will claim half of your retirement, half of your investments, and I will force the immediate liquidation of that coastal mansion you bought for your parents. Your parents, Thomas and Evelyn, will be thrown out on the street, and you will be paying me permanent alimony for the rest of your miserable life." He stood there breathing heavily, waiting for me to break. He expected tears, apologies, or at least a flicker of fear. He desperately needed me to shrink back into the compliant, quiet wife he thought he had married. I maintained direct eye contact, not breaking his gaze for a full 10 seconds. Then I simply smiled. It was a bright, terrifyingly calm smile that made him take an involuntary step backward. I turned the handle, pulled open my car door, and slid gracefully into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the powerful motor roaring to life and echoing off the concrete walls. I rolled the window down just enough to look him directly in the eyes one last time. "You can try to take my money in divorce court," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "But you are going to need a very good lawyer just to stay out of federal prison. Check your email, Marcus. I just sent a detailed summary of your little strategic investments directly to the state medical board, and I copied the FBI." I watched him shrink away into the shadows of my rearview mirror as I expertly navigated the steep concrete ramp toward the bright sunlit street waiting above. The satisfaction of that parking garage encounter was a potent rush, but my analytical mind began calculating the next variable. I knew Marcus and his incredibly toxic family were like cornered, desperate animals right now. They would strike back using whatever leverage they falsely believed they possessed. My mobile phone vibrated violently against the smooth leather center console before I could even merge safely onto the busy interstate highway. The caller identification display flashed my father's name. I tapped the screen to answer, expecting him to ask a question about our dinner plans at the Ritz-Carlton. Instead, a heavy, terrified silence greeted me through the speakers. My father was a proud working-class man who had never asked anyone for a handout in his entire life. His breathing over the connection was shallow, fast, and completely erratic. He sounded entirely broken. He finally managed to stammer out that a hostile process server had just banged aggressively on their front door in Atlanta. The man had handed my elderly parents a formal notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction. They had exactly 30 days to vacate the property they had lovingly maintained for 3 decades. I pulled my rental car sharply onto the gravel shoulder of the highway, my tires kicking up a cloud of dust. I demanded my father take a deep breath and read the text at the top of the legal document directly to me. He stumbled over the complex financial jargon, his voice shaking with humiliation, but the core message was painfully clear. It was a formal notice of default on a high-interest reverse mortgage. My blood ran cold. My parents owned that modest brick house outright. They had paid off their 30-year mortgage with factory wages 5 years before I even met Marcus. I asked my father sharply when he had ever sat down and signed legal paperwork for a reverse mortgage. He swore to me that he had not done any such thing. He said the only financial documents he had signed in the last 5 years were the helpful tax relief forms Marcus had generously prepared for them 2 years ago. Marcus had visited their house claiming he was utilizing his elite dental clinic accountants to secure my parents a massive senior citizen property tax exemption. It was a calculated, malicious lie. Marcus had buried a predatory reverse mortgage application deep inside a stack of confusing tax documents, forcing my trusting father to sign away the equity of his own home. The overall strategy was sickeningly transparent. Sarah and Marcus had realized during our morning confrontation that threatening my corporate career was a dead end. They knew they could not legally touch my protected offshore trusts or my heavily guarded commercial real estate portfolio. So they pivoted their attack and went after the only vulnerable, unprotected target left on the board. They wanted to render my elderly parents homeless and destitute. It was a brutal extortion play. They fully expected me to panic and break down. They expected me to offer a desperate immediate trade, exchanging the deed to the $15 million coastal estate to save my parents from living on the street. I firmly told my father to lock all the heavy deadbolts, ignore any further knocks at their front door, and patiently wait for my immediate arrival. I merged back into the highway traffic, pressing my foot heavily onto the accelerator. I did not drive to their house to offer emotional comfort. I drove straight back to my highly secure office at Vanguard Financial Group. Emotion was a liability I could not afford right now. I needed cold, hard, indisputable data. I bypassed the lobby security, rode the private elevator up to my executive suite, and immediately locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I booted up my workstation and accessed the heavily encrypted county property registry database. As a senior forensic auditor handling multi-million-dollar portfolios, I had immediate government clearance to pull the raw, unredacted mortgage filings for any property in the state. I typed in my parents' address and brought the scanned document of the reverse mortgage onto my dual monitors. The financial terms outlined in the binding contract were criminally predatory, featuring rapidly ballooning interest rates specifically designed by Marcus to force a rapid and completely unavoidable default. But the underlying financial structure was not the most interesting part of the digital document. I zoomed in on the final page of the contract, focusing my undivided attention on the official notary seal stamped firmly at the bottom of the signature line. A legal real estate transfer required a certified public notary to physically witness and verify the true identities of the signers. I squinted at the blue ink bleeding into the scanned paper. The authorized signature belonged to a man named Gregory Vance. The specific name sounded vaguely familiar, triggering a distant memory from a miserable family Thanksgiving dinner years ago. I opened my elite background check software and ran a comprehensive federal search on Gregory Vance. The detailed results populated instantly across my screen. Gregory Vance was Sarah's first cousin. He currently lived in the exact same county where the fraudulent documents were quietly filed. I cross-referenced his full legal name with the State Licensing Board database for public notaries. The system processed the request for 2 seconds before flashing a red alert banner across my monitor. The final piece of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place, illuminating a careless mistake so unbelievably massive it would guarantee federal prison time for everyone involved. Gregory Vance had his notary license revoked by the state board exactly 3 years ago for document falsification and bribery. The reverse mortgage threatening my parents was not just a shady business deal. The entire document was an act of explicit federal fraud. The humid coastal air clung to my skin, but inside the sprawling mansion, the atmosphere was a chilling cocktail of expensive perfume and desperate artifice. I stepped onto the driveway, my heels clicking sharply against the manicured pavers. I wore a backless midnight blue silk gown that cost more than Barbara's entire wardrobe, my hair styled in sleek modern waves. I looked like a woman who owned the world, which was a significant upgrade from the woman who had spent 5 years being told she was merely a competent assistant. I walked toward the glowing entrance where the sound of jazz and clinking crystal filled the night, feeling the heavy weight of the forensic audit folder tucked securely against my hip. Sarah was stationed at the threshold like a bouncer in a cocktail dress. She had clearly been watching for me, her face twisting into a sneer the moment she caught sight of my silhouette against the moonlight. She stepped into my path, spreading her arms wide to block the double doors. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my skin, her eyes raking over me with a calculated, dismissive gaze. "This is a private ticketed event, Chloe," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a sharp, ugly condescension. "And honestly, look at yourself. You absolutely do not fit the aesthetic of this crowd. These are people of status, people with real generational wealth. You are just a bookkeeper who wandered away from her desk. Go back to your sad little apartment and hide. You are making everyone uncomfortable just by standing there." I didn't blink. I didn't let her pathetic attempt to make me feel small take hold. I simply stood my ground, my posture relaxed and utterly confident. I knew exactly who was inside that room. I knew which of the guests had retained my firm to perform clandestine audits on their own failing investments. I knew which board members were currently under my professional protection. Sarah's attempt to shame me based on my aesthetic was not just petty. It was an act of profound, weaponized ignorance. I shifted my weight, letting my gaze drift past her shoulder toward the glittering room where the local elite were mingling, blissfully unaware of the financial ruin currently masquerading as their hostess. "Move, Sarah," I said, my voice low and devoid of any warmth. "You are not a bouncer, and you are certainly not a guest with any authority here." When she didn't budge, I didn't resort to a shoving match. I simply took a slow, deliberate step forward, using the subtle pressure of my presence to force her to retreat. She looked startled by the sudden shift in my demeanor, her eyes widening as she stumbled back onto the polished hardwood of the foyer. The shock of being dismissed so effortlessly seemed to drain the color from her face, leaving her sputtering as I glided past her, the fabric of my gown whispering against the floorboards. The room went quiet, then erupted into polite, curious murmurs. The elite of the coastal city turned toward the entrance, their champagne glasses frozen mid-air. Barbara was in the center of the room, standing beside Marcus, who looked like he had just swallowed a very bitter pill. She was holding court, gesturing expansively at the vaulted ceilings, likely detailing the recent renovations she claimed to have overseen. Her face went slack as she spotted me, the glass in her hand wobbling dangerously. Marcus turned a sickly shade of gray, his hand instinctively going to his phone as if calling for help would somehow reverse reality. I didn't stop for them. I walked directly to the mahogany-topped bar in the corner where the DJ was set up, and I tapped the microphone. The resulting feedback screech silenced every single person in the mansion. I turned toward the crowd, offering a smile that was perfectly polite and absolutely lethal. I looked at the board members of the city's most exclusive charity people who had invited Barbara out of social obligation, and I gave them a nod. Then I looked at Barbara, who was hyperventilating beside the fireplace. "I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank our hosts for this evening," I said, my voice ringing clearly through the speakers. "Barbara and Marcus have been so incredibly generous with this estate. It takes a special kind of person to open their doors to the community, especially when those doors belong to someone else." The laughter was hesitant, a ripple of confusion moving through the room. I didn't give them time to recover. I pressed the remote in my palm, and the blank wall behind the fireplace instantly glowed with the stark blue-white light of a digital projector. The document that appeared was not an invitation, nor was it a celebration. It was a formal, stamped and highly official notice of foreclosure and distraint of assets. I had highlighted the most important section in a vibrant, impossible-to-miss red. It explicitly detailed the systematic delinquency of the dental clinic's payroll account and the subsequent seizure of the property by federal authorities for gross tax evasion and embezzlement. I didn't need to say a word. I just stood there, the cool blue light of the document reflecting off the shocked faces of the guests. I watched the realization wash over Marcus, whose eyes were fixed on the projected total debt, a number that exceeded his annual revenue by 3 times. "You wanted the house, Barbara?" I asked, my voice cutting through the suffocating silence. It's a bit hard to play hostess when the building itself is under federal asset seizure. I then swiveled my gaze to Sarah, who was still standing by the door, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "And perhaps, Sarah, you should ask your father why his failing construction firm was the beneficiary of $200,000 wired from a dental clinic's payroll account last Friday. I'm sure the tax auditors would love to hear your explanation for that particular investment strategy." Panicked whispers and the sharp clinking of crystal erupted as people hastily set their champagne flutes down. Sarah's face flushed a deep mottled crimson. Her mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a fish gasping for air, completely incapable of formulating a coherent response. She realized the elite guests were no longer looking at her with admiration, but with sheer disgust. The wealthy clients I had previously audited were already pulling out their phones, frantically texting their legal counsel to distance themselves from this unfolding disaster. Marcus tried to grab the microphone to issue a desperate denial, but his hands shook. He knocked over a crystal vase. It shattered across hardwood, the sharp crack snapping Sarah out of her paralysis. Instead of answering my question, Sarah weaponized her fragility. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck, and let out a piercing, theatrical sob that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She pulled her smartphone from her designer clutch and dialed the police with frantic fingers. As the dispatcher answered, her voice shifted into a high-pitched, hysterical wail. She screamed that a deranged, aggressive woman had broken into their private charity gala and was threatening everyone. Her entire family immediately rallied around this fabricated narrative. She layered on the buzzwords, claiming she feared for her life and describing me as hostile. It was a masterclass in manipulative victimhood, relying entirely on racial microaggressions, designed specifically to provoke a swift, potentially lethal response from local law enforcement. Barbara rushed to Sarah's side, wrapping a fiercely protective arm around her daughter's trembling shoulders while glaring at me with triumphant malice. She truly believed they had won the upper hand. She thought the impending arrival of the police would force me to flee the premises in utter disgrace, leaving them to spin a convenient face-saving narrative to the remaining high society guests. But I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly still, my posture relaxed and commanding, watching the attendees slowly back away from the center of the room. They created a wide, empty circle around the fireplace, treating my in-laws like contagious pariahs. The jazz band had abruptly stopped playing, leaving only the grating sound of Sarah's exaggerated echoing sobs and the distant, rapidly approaching wail of police sirens cutting through the cool night air. The heavy oak front doors flew open with violent, terrifying force. 3 local police officers stormed into the opulent foyer, their expressions hard and their hands resting firmly on their holstered weapons. They scanned the crowded room with tactical precision, the beams of their heavy flashlights cutting through the dim, romantic lighting of the charity event. Sarah immediately broke away from Barbara's embrace and sprinted toward the commanding officer. She threw herself practically at his feet, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. She cried out that I had forced my way inside, that I was a dangerous stalker completely obsessed with her family, and that I needed to be removed in handcuffs immediately before I hurt someone. Barbara stood behind her, a smug, deeply satisfied smirk playing across her perfectly contoured face as she anticipated my imminent downfall. The commanding officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern jawline and zero tolerance for chaos, locked his eyes directly on me. He stepped forward, signaling silently for his deputies to flank him and secure the perimeter. He loudly ordered me to keep my hands where he could see them and demanded my identification, his voice ringing with absolute authority. The tension in the room was thick and suffocating. Dozens of wealthy spectators held their collective breath, fully expecting to witness my humiliating, highly public arrest. Marcus finally managed a weak, arrogant laugh, loudly declaring to the crowd that I was about to learn a very painful lesson about trespassing on private property. He urged the officers to handle me roughly, boldly, claiming I was deeply unpredictable and emotionally disturbed. He was practically vibrating with the desperate need to see me put in my place. I did not flinch, nor did I raise my voice in panic. I maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact with the commanding officer, matching his authoritative energy with my own unshakable calm. With slow, deliberate movements specifically designed to show zero threat, I reached into the sleek leather portfolio I had carried in under my arm. I did not pull out a standard driver license or a flimsy business card. I extracted a thick, heavily tabbed legal binder and extended it gracefully toward the officer. He frowned, his hand hovering over his utility belt, hesitating for a fraction of a second before taking the heavy binder from my hands. I instructed him in a calm, flat voice that carried across the silent room to flip directly to the first highlighted page inside the plastic sleeve. His eyes scanned the crisp official document, his professional scowl slowly morphing into total confusion. It was the certified unassailable deed to the coastal mansion, registered legally under my private holding corporation, clear of any mortgages, liens, or disputes. The officer's brow furrowed deeply as he read the undeniable proof of ownership, verifying the state seals and signatures. Then I told him to turn to the second tab. This document carried the fresh, deeply embossed seal of the county courthouse. It was a comprehensive, immediate restraining order against Marcus and Sarah, signed and approved by a superior court judge exactly 8 hours prior. The legal filing explicitly cited extensive financial stalking, documented harassment, and predatory extortion attempts. The officer closed the heavy binder, the snap of the ring sounding like a gunshot. He looked up, his hand dropping away from his weapon, and slowly turned his cold gaze directly toward Sarah. Barbara was no longer smiling. The beautiful facade of their stolen wealth was crumbling right in front of them, and I was going to make absolutely sure they felt every single second of the spectacular, humiliating crash. The commanding officer frowned, tracing the raised seal on my binder. He looked ready to clear the room, but Marcus was not finished playing his desperate hand. Sweating profusely, Marcus lunged toward the grand piano, where he had stashed a sleek briefcase. He fumbled with the clasps, tearing a manila envelope from the interior. He marched back to the officers, waving a sheaf of papers aggressively, his face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. "She is lying!" Marcus bellowed, his voice cracking under the immense strain of his crumbling reality. "I am the legal owner of this estate. She transferred the deed to me a month ago as part of our marital separation agreement. I have the signed documentation right here. She is trespassing on my property, ruining our charity gala, and terrorizing my family." He shoved the papers into the officer's free hand. The cop sighed heavily, realizing he had just stepped into a massive domestic dispute. I watched closely as he reviewed Marcus's document. It appeared to be a standard quit-claim deed, complete with a notary stamp and a signature that looked remarkably like mine. The officer glanced between my pristine corporate binder and Marcus's crumpled papers. The absolute clarity in his eyes vanished, replaced by sheer bureaucratic frustration. "Ma'am, this gentleman has a notarized property transfer with your signature on it," the officer stated, his tone shifting from authoritative to annoyed. "You have a corporate deed and a restraining order. He claims this is his primary legal residence and that your restraining order was obtained under false pretenses regarding property ownership." "That document is a complete fabrication," I stated evenly, maintaining my calm composure. "He is currently under federal investigation for financial fraud. That signature is forged." "That is for a judge to decide," the officer replied, handing both sets of documents back. "This is a civil matter. I cannot legally evict a man from a property he claims to own with notarized documentation, not without an eviction mandate that specifically addresses these conflicting deeds. The restraining order is valid, but the residency dispute supersedes immediate removal. I suggest you leave the premises, ma'am, and take this up with your civil attorneys tomorrow. If you stay and escalate this, I will arrest you for disturbing the peace." Sarah let out a dramatic, breathless sigh of relief, leaning heavily against her mother. Barbara's smug smile returned instantly, her eyes flashing with venomous triumph. They believed they had won the battle, securing their stolen fortress for at least one more night. Marcus puffed out his chest, mistakenly thinking his amateur forgery had genuinely outsmarted a forensic accountant. I did not argue with the police. Arguing with law enforcement over civil disputes was a fool's errand. I gave the officer a nod. I turned on my heel and walked out, my head held high. I glided past the stunned high society guests, many of whom were already whispering frantically and heading for the exits. The gala was effectively ruined, poisoned by the undeniable stench of scandal and police intervention. But leaving Marcus in the house was a temporary setback I intended to rectify immediately. I drove my rental car back to my hotel suite in the financial district. The quiet elegance of the room offered a stark contrast to the chaotic circus I had just left behind. I shed the restrictive designer gown, slipping into comfortable silk pajamas. I ordered black coffee and set up my mobile workstation on the glass dining table. My anger was a cold, focused energy. Marcus had produced a forgery so convincing it momentarily stalled the police. I needed to know exactly how he managed it. Before leaving the mansion, my photographic memory and a hidden camera in my clutch captured the details of Marcus's fake deed. I pulled up the high-resolution images on my dual monitors. I zoomed in on the signature line, analyzing the digital ink structure pixel by pixel. Marcus was a cosmetic dentist. He was not a master forger. He did not have the steady hand required to mimic my cursive script. He had utilized software. I opened my personal digital archives, a heavily encrypted server containing every single legal document I had ever signed. I ran an overlay program comparing the signature on Marcus's fake deed against thousands of my verified signatures. Human signatures possess natural variations in pressure, angle, and speed. A forged signature drawn by hand looks shaky. A digital clone, however, looks entirely too perfect. The software processed the complex image for several tense moments before locking onto a match. The red alert flashed across my screen, highlighting the source document. It was not a bank loan, a car lease, or a tax return. The signature on the fake deed had been digitally lifted pixel for pixel from a comprehensive life insurance policy I had taken out 5 years ago shortly after we were married. My breath caught in my dry throat. I immediately pulled up the original insurance file. It was a massive policy naming Marcus as the sole irrevocable beneficiary. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I logged directly into the insurance provider's secure web portal. I navigated to my account's recent activity log. The digital screen loaded, revealing a series of transactions that made my blood run absolutely cold. 3 weeks ago, while I was traveling for work, Marcus had attempted to access the policy. He submitted a request to the insurance company to dramatically increase the payout amount and expedite a partial cash withdrawal, claiming extreme financial hardship. The company firmly denied the request, citing the mandatory requirement for my direct in-person verbal authorization. He had not just forged a deed to steal a coastal mansion. The property forgery was an act of desperate improvisation. He had been probing my life insurance policy, trying to leverage my death benefits, while actively draining our marital assets to fund Sarah's bankrupt family. Marcus was not simply a greedy, embezzling husband trying to upgrade his lifestyle. The digital footprint proved he was actively preparing the financial groundwork for my sudden, tragic demise. He was planning something darker than real estate theft. The revelation that Marcus was actively attempting to monetize my potential death shifted my perspective from defensive survival to absolute systematic destruction. He was no longer just a cheating, embezzling husband. He was a legitimate physical threat. By dawn, the adrenaline had burned away, leaving a crystalline tactical clarity. I could not just fight Marcus directly. He and his family operated as a unified toxic ecosystem, protecting each other's lies to maintain their fragile social standing. To completely neutralize the threat, I needed to dismantle their alliance from the inside. I needed to turn the wolves against each other. My immediate target was Sarah. She was the loudest, the most arrogant, and historically the most careless. She constantly flaunted her generational wealth, endlessly bragging about her family's untouchable legacy, while simultaneously belittling my parents' honest working-class background. But true generational wealth does not require desperate, frantic calls to emergency services when a foreclosure notice is presented. True wealth does not panic. Sarah's reaction at the mansion had exposed a massive vulnerability, a crack in her flawless porcelain mask. I brewed a second pot of dark roast coffee, cracked my knuckles, and opened a fresh, secure incognito browser on my workstation. As a senior forensic accountant, tracing hidden assets and exposing phantom wealth was not just my job. It was my particular area of genius. I started by pulling the public records for Sarah's sprawling equestrian estate, a property she constantly bragged about owning outright. It took exactly 3 minutes of cross-referencing county tax databases to discover the bitter truth. The estate was heavily leveraged, drowning in 3 separate high-interest mortgages, and the property taxes had been severely delinquent for over 18 months. Her credit profile was a catastrophic wasteland of maxed-out premium credit cards, defaulted personal loans, and desperate lines of credit secured by assets she did not actually possess. Sarah was not a wealthy heiress. She was functionally bankrupt, living entirely on a mountain of high-yield debt ready to collapse at any moment. However, the financial math still did not add up. Even with massive credit card debt, her extravagant daily spending habits required a continuous liquid cash flow. She was paying for weekly spa treatments, elite country club dues, and spontaneous shopping sprees in Paris. That kind of lifestyle demanded thousands of dollars in hard currency every single week. She had to be aggressively siphoning cash from a completely unprotected, highly vulnerable source close to home. I expanded my search parameters, pulling the financial threads connecting Sarah to the rest of her family. I accessed the Vanguard internal routing databases, utilizing my highest security clearance to track regional wire transfers associated with the family's primary banking institution. The digital breadcrumbs led directly to Barbara's personal retirement portfolio. Barbara had spent decades cultivating a massive conservative investment fund, trusting a boutique local wealth management firm to handle her daily distributions. I initiated a deep dive into Barbara's specific routing numbers. What I found was a masterpiece of familial betrayal. For the past 14 months, precisely timed transfers had been quietly bleeding Barbara's retirement accounts dry. Every second Tuesday, exactly $4,500 was wired from Barbara's primary holding account into a shell corporation registered under the name Aesthetic Solutions LLC. I pulled the corporate registry for that specific entity. The sole managing director was Sarah. She had forged her mother's signature on a recurring wire authorization form, successfully bypassing the bank's rudimentary security checks. Sarah was funding her designer shoes, her luxury vacations, and her arrogant elitist persona by methodically stealing her own mother's life savings. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. Sarah had stolen nearly $300,000 directly from Barbara, the very woman who viciously defended her at every turn. Barbara was fiercely protective of her money, viewing her wealth as the ultimate symbol of her superiority over people like me. If she discovered that her golden child was secretly a common thief who had decimated her retirement safety net, the resulting explosion would completely obliterate their alliance. Marcus would be caught in the middle of a nuclear family war, entirely stripping him of the financial and social support he desperately needed to fight me in court. I compiled the evidence meticulously. I printed the official bank routing logs, the fraudulent wire transfer authorizations featuring Sarah's clumsy forgery, and the state corporate registry documents proving Sarah owned the receiving shell company. I highlighted every single stolen dollar in bright, unmistakable neon yellow ink, ensuring no one could possibly miss the severity of the ongoing theft. I needed to deliver this information in a way that guaranteed Barbara could not quietly sweep it under the rug to protect the family image. It had to be a public, humiliating execution of Sarah's carefully crafted reputation. Barbara spent every Wednesday afternoon holding court at the Oak Haven Country Club. She sat at the premier table in the main dining room, surrounded by the wealthiest, most gossip-hungry women in the entire coastal city. It was her sanctuary, her stage, and the very center of her social universe. I placed the damning financial evidence into a heavy tamper-proof courier envelope lined with security mesh. I did not use a standard mailing label. Instead, I printed a bright red, highly visible sticker that read, "Urgent financial disclosure, immediate personal attention required." I walked down to the polished marble lobby and handed the package to a bonded courier service, paying for the expedited delivery entirely in crisp, untraceable cash. I gave the courier explicit, unbending instructions. He was to walk directly into the Oak Haven Country Club dining room at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, bypass the reception desk, and hand the envelope directly to Barbara in front of all her elite friends. I watched the courier speed away on his motorcycle, a cold smile touching my lips. The fuse was officially lit, and the explosion was going to be spectacular. The Oak Haven Country Club dining room hummed with the quiet, expensive murmur of old money and idle gossip. Crystal water goblets caught the afternoon sunlight as Barbara held court at the center table, regaling her three closest friends with exaggerated tales of her upcoming cruise. She paused mid-sentence, a perfectly manicured hand suspended in the air as the heavy mahogany doors of the dining room swung violently open. The bonded courier marched straight past the protesting maitre d', his heavy boots thudding against the imported carpet. He ignored the indignant gasps of the high society patrons and navigated directly to Barbara. He dropped the thick security meshed envelope right next to her untouched salad. The neon red sticker demanding immediate personal attention practically glowed against the white tablecloth. Barbara forced a tight, dismissive laugh, attempting to maintain her unflappable facade. She joked to her eager audience about the dramatic lengths real estate brokers would go to for her attention. But as her fingernails broke the seal and pulled out the thick stack of financial documents, her practiced smile evaporated. The neon yellow highlights illuminating her depleted retirement accounts jumped off the pages. Her friends leaned in, their eyes wide with predatory curiosity, catching clear glimpses of the bold lettering reading Aesthetic Solutions LLC and the devastatingly low account balances. The sheer suffocating humiliation washed over Barbara in a tidal wave. She dropped the papers as if they had physically burned her, her face draining to an ashen, sickly gray. The whispered rumors began circulating the dining room before she could even push her chair back and flee. Humiliation instantly morphed into blinding, unadulterated rage. Barbara stormed out of the dining hall, abandoning her elite friends without a single word of explanation. She locked herself in the club private executive lounge and immediately dialed Sarah, her voice shaking with a terrifying, venomous fury. She demanded that Sarah and Marcus drop everything and meet her at the club right that second. I was already sitting in my rental car across the street, watching the main entrance after receiving the courier delivery confirmation. I waited precisely 20 minutes until Marcus' leased luxury SUV aggressively screeched into the valet circle. I stepped out of my vehicle, smoothing down my tailored blazer, and followed them through the ornate lobby, slipping through the heavy oak doors of the executive lounge right on their heels. Barbara was pacing the length of the Persian rug like a caged animal. The damning bank statements were scattered across the polished mahogany conference table. When she spun around and saw me standing calmly by the closed door, her anger found a convenient, immediate target. She lunged forward, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls, accusing me of fabricating the entire stack of documents. She screamed that I was a bitter, vindictive liar, attempting to frame her golden child to distract from my own impending divorce. Sarah immediately seized the opportunity, falling onto a plush leather sofa and bursting into theatrical, breathless sobs. She clutched her chest, swearing she had never seen those shell company documents in her life, and pleading with her mother not to believe my malicious lies. I did not raise my voice, nor did I engage with their manufactured hysteria. I simply unclasped my leather portfolio and pulled out my tablet. I walked directly to the conference table, placing the glowing screen right over the scattered highlighted papers. I had pulled up the verified time-stamped digital footprint of the shell company. I calmly instructed Barbara to match the exact dates of the wire transfers leaving her retirement fund with the exact dates Sarah had prominently posted about her extravagant purchases on social media. A $5,000 wire transfer on a Tuesday, perfectly aligned with Sarah posting a photo of a new limited edition designer bag on a Wednesday. A $10,000 withdrawal directly corresponded to Sarah boasting about her spontaneous first-class trip to Paris. The irrefutable digital proof destroyed every single avenue of denial. Barbara stared at the screen, her eyes darting back and forth between the dates, the numbers, and the corresponding photographs of her daughter flaunting the stolen wealth. The reality of the situation crushed the last remaining fragments of her denial. Her own daughter, the woman she constantly paraded as a paragon of generational wealth, was a common thief who had systematically plundered her life savings to fund a fake, bankrupt existence. Sarah realized she was completely trapped. The fake sobbing abruptly stopped, replaced by a genuine, terrifying panic. She scrambled up from the sofa, reaching out to grab her mother's arm, babbling desperate, pathetic excuses about bridge loans and temporary cash flow issues. Barbara did not speak. She pulled her arm back and delivered a resounding slap across Sarah's face. The crack echoed through the lounge like a gunshot, leaving a red handprint blooming on her pale cheek. The toxic alliance that terrorized me was finally fracturing. Sarah stumbled backward, crying out in pain. Before Barbara could unleash her verbal tirade, Marcus lost his mind. He lunged across the room, violently shoving Barbara away. The older woman crashed against the table, gasping loudly in pain. I stepped back, watching the ultimate implosion. Marcus stood protectively in front of Sarah, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with deranged intensity. He screamed at Barbara never to touch her again, his voice cracking with a ferocity that went far beyond basic loyalty. In his blind rage, his filter vanished. He bellowed that Barbara deserved to lose every penny, boasting that he and Sarah were going to take the house and the life insurance because they deserved a beautiful life together. The room plunged into deafening silence as the weight of his words registered. Marcus pulled Sarah flush against his chest in a deeply intimate, possessive gesture. The final puzzle piece slammed into place. My husband was not just helping his sister-in-law. They had been sleeping together for months. The absolute silence in the executive lounge was deafening, broken only by Barbara's ragged, shallow breathing as she stared at her son and her daughter-in-law. The physical reality of Marcus wrapping his arms around his brother's wife sent a visible, violent shudder through the older woman. Her knees buckled slightly, forcing her to grip the edge of the heavy mahogany conference table for support. The sprawling country club estate, the pristine family reputation, the generations of carefully curated social standing instantly dissolved into a sickening, incestuous puddle right before her eyes. Sarah buried her face in Marcus's expensive suit jacket, her shoulders trembling no longer from a manufactured panic attack, but from the raw, unadulterated terror of total exposure. I forced my hands to fly up to my mouth, letting out a sharp, perfectly timed gasp of horror. I stumbled backward a few paces, allowing my eyes to widen in an expression of complete devastation. I played the role of the shattered, blindsided wife flawlessly, but beneath my carefully arranged mask of heartbreak, my mind was running a cold, victorious victory lap. I already knew. The digital footprint from Marcus's fake property deed had shared distinct IP addresses with Sarah's supposedly private corporate servers. I had tracked their overlapping hotel charges and matching flight itineraries weeks ago during my initial forensic audit of our marital assets. The affair was the dirtiest, most volatile weapon in my arsenal, and I had simply been waiting for the perfect maximum casualty moment to detonate it. Barbara finally found her voice. It was a guttural, horrifying sound, stripped of all her usual aristocratic polish. She pointed a trembling finger at Marcus, her face completely drained of blood. She demanded to know how long he had been sleeping in his own brother's bed. She screamed that David, her loyal, hard-working eldest son, worshipped the ground Sarah walked on. The betrayal was too immense for Barbara to process. Her retirement fund had been gutted by the exact same woman who was actively destroying her family tree. Marcus did not cower. Instead of begging for forgiveness or showing an ounce of remorse for decimating his brother's life, his narcissistic ego seized complete control. He puffed out his chest, stepping squarely in front of Sarah to shield her from his mother's wrath. He sneered, his face twisting into an ugly mask of arrogant entitlement. He loudly declared that David was weak, a pathetic workaholic who neglected his beautiful wife. Marcus proclaimed that he was simply stepping up to provide Sarah with the passion and attention she desperately craved and fundamentally deserved. I seized the opening, stepping forward to verbally sever his Achilles heel. I looked at him with absolute disgust, my voice dripping with cold, calculated pity. I told him he was nothing but a fragile, insecure fraud playing dress-up with stolen money. I reminded him loudly enough for the sound to carry to the hallway that he could not even afford the luxury hotel suites he used to sleep with his brother's wife. I pointed directly at the scattered, highlighted bank statements on the table. I stated the brutal truth Sarah had to embezzle from his own mother's retirement fund just to subsidize his pathetic illusion of wealth. He was not an alpha male rescuing a neglected wife. He was a financial parasite entirely dependent on stolen cash and forged documents to maintain his fragile masculinity. The surgical strike hit its mark. The veins in Marcus's neck bulged and his face turned a dangerous apoplectic shade of purple. His fragile ego shattered into a million jagged pieces. He lashed out, projecting all of his monumental failures directly onto me. He screamed that I was the reason he had to seek out another woman. He paced the room frantically, furiously listing my supposed failures as a partner. I worked too many hours. I cared more about my corporate audits and digital portfolios than making him feel like a man. I lacked domestic grace. I refused to attend his superficial networking events and never played the role of the traditional submissive wife. He yelled that coming home to me was like walking into a corporate boardroom completely devoid of warmth or affection. Sarah, emboldened by Marcus's aggressive defense, peeked out from behind his shoulder. Her cheek was still bright red from Barbara's vicious slap, but her inherent elitist snobbery remained deeply ingrained. She wiped a smudge of expensive mascara from her eye and lifted her chin defiantly. She looked me up and down with utter contempt, stating that Marcus was a man of high society who required a woman capable of matching his refined tastes. She claimed I was just a boring, middle-class calculator who did not understand how the upper echelon functioned. Marcus deserved a woman of his own caliber, she declared, intertwining her fingers tightly with his. I laughed. It was a sharp, biting sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. I stared at Sarah, my eyes raking over her trembling frame and tear-stained designer dress. I mocked their definition of caliber. I asked if matching his caliber meant committing felony wire fraud, forging property deeds, and draining elderly family members' bank accounts to buy a pair of seasonal heels. I told them they were absolutely perfect for each other, two morally bankrupt thieves, desperately clinging to an illusion of grandeur, while their entire world burned to ashes around them. The tension peaked, hanging in the air like heavy, suffocating smoke. Marcus opened his mouth to scream another defense, raising his hand aggressively in my direction. A sharp electronic chime cut through the chaotic shouting. The sound originated from the center of the mahogany conference table. My smartphone lay completely flat beside the scattered bank statements, the screen glowing brightly in the dim lounge. The call timer indicated an active connection of 42 minutes. I had dialed the number before I even stepped out of my rental car, slipping the device onto the table the moment I entered the room. I reached forward and tapped the speaker icon, amplifying the connection. The heavy, ragged breathing echoing through the phone speaker did not belong to a police dispatcher or a divorce attorney. I heard everything. David's voice echoed through the executive lounge, entirely devoid of emotion, sounding hollow and completely dead inside. Marcus froze, his aggressive posture collapsing instantly. Sarah let out a terrified, strangled gasp, ripping her hand away from Marcus, as if his skin had suddenly caught fire. I stared directly at my husband, offering a cold, utterly merciless smile. David had been listening to his wife and his brother outline the graphic details of their affair for the last 40 minutes. I am pulling into the valet circle right now. David's voice rasped through the speaker, chilling the air in the executive lounge. The sheer predatory calm in his tone was infinitely more terrifying than any screaming match could have ever been. Sarah scrambled backward, tripping over the heavy legs of a leather armchair, her eyes wide with animalistic panic. She frantically grabbed her designer purse, looking around wildly for a secondary exit that simply did not exist. Marcus completely abandoned his protective stance. His false bravado evaporated instantly. He lunged for the heavy mahogany door, desperate to intercept his brother before David could breach the club's inner sanctum and cause a public scene. I calmly picked up my phone, ended the active call, and followed them out into the brilliant afternoon sunlight. I wanted a front-row seat to the utter destruction of Marcus's remaining dignity today. The pristine manicured gravel of the exclusive Oak Haven Country Club parking lot was immediately shattered by the violent, deafening squeal of burning rubber. David's silver sedan slammed to a halt, resting diagonally across the pristine brick pavers and blocking the exit lanes. He kicked the driver's side door open before the vehicle had even fully settled. He marched toward the main entrance with a dark, terrifying purpose, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He did not say a single word as a terrified Marcus stumbled out of the heavy glass double doors. He did not ask for an explanation, nor did he demand an apology. David simply closed the distance in 3 long strides and drove his fist directly into Marcus's perfectly sculpted jaw. The sickening, resonant crack of bone against bone loudly echoed across the parked luxury cars. Marcus stumbled backward, his arms flailing wildly, as blood instantly poured from his split lip, staining his custom-tailored white collar. High society patrons dressed in immaculate tennis whites and pastel polos froze in their tracks. Valets dropped sets of keys in sheer shock. The country club elite watched in absolute stunned silence as the two brothers collided in a brutal, humiliating brawl right on the front steps. Marcus tried to fight back, throwing wildly uncoordinated punches, but David was fueled by the agonizing clarity of ultimate betrayal. David tackled him hard against the hood of a vintage sports car, denting the expensive metal frame as he unleashed months of suppressed rage. Sarah shrieked from the entrance, completely paralyzed by the violent spectacle she had orchestrated, her hands covering her face in a pathetic display of absolute horror. Barbara finally managed to stumble out of the club doors, clutching her chest, as the full, crushing weight of her family's implosion hit her. She watched her sons tearing each other apart like rabid dogs, in front of the very people she had spent decades trying to impress. The sheer embarrassment shattered her pristine image into irreparable fragments. She screamed for them to stop, her voice cracking with pure desperation as she waded into the chaotic fray. She lunged forward, attempting to wedge her frail body between the brawling men. The sheer physical exertion, combined with the catastrophic emotional shock of the stolen retirement funds and the incestuous affair, was simply too much for her to process. Her eyes rolled back into her head, her knees buckled instantly, and she collapsed violently onto the hard, unforgiving pavement. Marcus immediately shoved his bleeding brother away, desperately pivoting back to his default savior complex. He fell to his knees beside his unconscious mother, shouting frantically for the stunned valets to call for a paramedic. He loudly proclaimed that he was a medical professional, attempting to seize control of the chaotic emergency to salvage some shred of his public hero persona. He ordered bystanders to step back, performing a grotesque pantomime of competence. But his arrogant demands were swiftly and decisively cut short. The country club general manager, flanked by 4 burly uniformed security guards, marched into the center of the fray. He ordered Marcus to back away from the woman and let the club's trained medical staff take over. The manager's face was a rigid mask of furious, uncompromising disgust. He did not care about Marcus's medical degree or Barbara's long-standing membership. He loudly informed Marcus, David, Sarah, and the still unconscious Barbara that their memberships were instantly and permanently revoked. He demanded they vacate the property the moment the ambulance cleared the scene, loudly promising to press criminal trespassing charges if any member of their disgraced family ever set foot on Oakhaven grounds again. The public banishment was the ultimate social execution. The ambulance arrived minutes later with wailing sirens, loading a semi-conscious Barbara onto a stretcher. David silently turned his back on his brother, walked to his sedan, and drove away forever without a backward glance. Marcus stood entirely alone in the center of the valet circle. His expensive suit was torn, his face was rapidly swelling into a tapestry of purple bruises, and his reputation was irreparably destroyed. He glared at me, his eyes burning with a cornered, frantic madness. He wiped a streak of blood from his chin and sneered, clinging desperately to his final pathetic illusion of power. He screamed that I had won nothing today. He yelled that he still possessed the signed property deed and the $200,000 he had successfully drained from our joint accounts before the freeze. He swore he was going to hire the most ruthless legal team in the state and bury me under a mountain of frivolous litigation until I was totally bankrupt and begging for mercy. He promised to make the rest of my life a living hell. I simply smiled, enjoying the warmth of the bright afternoon sun against my skin as I watched his unhinged tantrum unfold. I raised my left hand and pointedly tapped the glass face of my watch. "You might want to check your banking app right now, Marcus." Marcus's bloodied fingers scrambled frantically against the smooth glass screen of his smartphone, leaving chaotic red smears across the display. He bypassed his lock screen with frantic urgency, his breath hitching audibly in the quiet afternoon air. He pulled up his primary banking application, expecting to see the reassuring 6-figure balance he had so arrogantly stolen just 48 hours prior. Instead, the screen glowed with a harsh, unyielding crimson error code. The numbers were entirely gone. In their place sat a stark, terrifying block of automated text declaring that all associated assets were completely restricted under the authority of the United States Department of the Treasury. The error explicitly cited a federal asset freeze pending a high-level criminal investigation. His bruised jaw dropped open, a wet, ragged sound escaping his throat. He tapped the refresh icon obsessively, hitting the screen so hard the glass threatened to crack under the localized pressure. The red warning message remained absolute and unchanging. He looked up at me, the arrogant sneer completely wiped from his swollen face, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man plummeting into a bottomless abyss. He demanded to know what kind of illegal hacking I had employed to lock him out of his own accounts. He threatened to call the police on me right then and there, claiming I was committing cybercrimes to manipulate his rightful funds. I stepped closer, invading his personal space, my posture radiating absolute control. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum devastating impact. I reminded him that my career as a senior forensic accountant did not solely involve balancing corporate spreadsheets or conducting mundane tax audits. My daily professional responsibilities revolved entirely around dismantling complex financial syndicates, identifying encrypted phantom wealth, and exposing sophisticated embezzlement rings for federal compliance agencies. He had severely underestimated my capabilities, choosing to view me as a boring traditional wife, rather than a highly trained certified financial investigator. I did not just internally freeze his stolen money using a civil family court injunction. That would have been temporary and easily contested by any competent divorce attorney. Instead, I took the absolute mountain of digital evidence I had meticulously gathered and handed it directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The moment Marcus decided to forge a property deed using a fabricated digital signature to secure an unauthorized home equity line of credit, he committed severe real estate fraud. However, when he took that fraudulently obtained $200,000 and routed it through a proxy server to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands to hide it from our divorce proceedings, he crossed a catastrophic legal threshold. The international transfer of illicitly gained funds automatically triggered an immediate federal money laundering alert. The banking algorithms flagged the suspicious offshore routing instantly. By providing the FBI with his exact IP addresses, the forged digital certificates, and the corresponding routing numbers, I handed the federal agents a perfectly wrapped, irrefutable criminal conviction. He was no longer dealing with a bitter spouse in a civil arbitration room. He was now the primary target of an active federal money laundering investigation involving interstate wire fraud and international financial evasion. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white beneath the vivid purple bruising. He swayed on his feet, the physical reality of a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence crashing down on his shoulders. He looked wildly around the empty valet circle, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. The country club staff watched the humiliating spectacle from behind the safety of the glass lobby doors, their faces a mixture of morbid fascination and absolute disgust. He was utterly trapped, stripped of his stolen wealth, his pristine reputation, and his freedom, all in a matter of 20 minutes. Sarah stood a few feet away, her hands clutching her expensive designer purse so tightly her knuckles were stark white. The sheer terror radiating from Marcus was highly contagious. Her elitist arrogance completely vanished, replaced by the primal, desperate instinct for immediate self-preservation. She was intimately involved in his financial life. She had knowingly received thousands of dollars from his accounts to fund her extravagant lifestyle. The realization that federal agents would inevitably subpoena every single financial connection tied to Marcus hit her like a physical blow. Accessory to federal wire fraud and money laundering carried sentences just as devastating as the primary charges. Without uttering a single word of comfort to the man she had just claimed was her soulmate, Sarah turned on her expensive heels and sprinted across the parking lot. She abandoned Marcus without a second thought, her panic overriding any lingering sense of loyalty or affection. She ran awkwardly in her high heels, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps as she navigated the rows of parked luxury vehicles. She frantically clicked the unlock button on her key fob, aiming it toward her pristine leased Mercedes, parked near the edge of the sprawling lot. The car headlights flashed briefly, a beacon of escape in her rapidly collapsing world. She yanked the driver's side door open and threw herself into the premium leather seat, slamming the door shut and immediately hitting the ignition button. The engine did not roar to life. Instead, a dull metallic click echoed from the dashboard. She hit the button again, her manicured fingers trembling violently. Nothing happened. The electronic ignition system had been completely deactivated. A loud hydraulic whine suddenly filled the air. Sarah jerked her head up, her eyes widening in absolute horror. A massive commercial tow truck was parked directly in front of her Mercedes, blocking it. The driver methodically secured thick steel cables to the front axle. I walked slowly across the asphalt, stopping right outside her window. I offered a chilling smile, tapping the glass. My own debt collection firm purchased your defaulted auto loan. Your luxury car is officially repossessed today. Sarah pounded her fists against the steering wheel as the hydraulic lift hoisted her precious Mercedes into the air. The physical manifestation of her carefully engineered reality was literally driving away down the oak-lined avenue. She was entirely stranded in her designer heels, shrieking hysterically at the tow truck driver, while Marcus remained frozen in the valet circle, utterly emasculated and staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. I did not linger to watch them grovel for a cab. I walked back to my rental car, slid behind the wheel, and drove away from the Oak Haven Country Club, leaving the burning wreckage of their social and financial lives in my rearview mirror. For 48 hours, my phone remained completely silent. The aggressive, threatening voicemails from Marcus abruptly ceased, replaced by a desperate, palpable void. Then on Thursday morning, a formal email arrived in my secure inbox from a high-priced, white-collar defense attorney representing both Marcus and Sarah. The arrogant demands for total submission were entirely gone. Instead, the message contained a pathetic, groveling plea for an emergency, off-the-record mediation meeting at the Seaside mansion. They were terrified of the FBI closing in and were begging for a truce, offering to settle the divorce out of court if I simply agreed to withdraw my federal whistleblower report. I knew exactly what kind of desperate trap they were attempting to set, which is precisely why I did not walk into that mansion alone. I drove to the coastal property with my parents, bringing them along, not for emotional support, but as crucial witnesses to the final definitive execution of my husband's ego. My mother and father walked nervously up the cobblestone path, deeply intimidated by the sprawling architecture and the toxic history contained within those massive walls. I held my head high, pushing open the heavy mahogany front door and leading them directly into the formal dining room. Marcus and Sarah were already seated at the long, polished table. They looked absolutely haggard. The unrelenting stress of the impending federal investigation had aged them both a decade in mere days. Marcus's face was still a mosaic of ugly, dark purple bruises from David's relentless parking lot assault, his left eye swollen nearly shut. Sarah sat rigidly beside him, stripped of her usual layered luxury jewelry and elitist smirk. She nervously chewed on her perfectly manicured thumbnail, her eyes darting toward my parents like a cornered animal evaluating potential prey. Marcus slid a thick, legally binding separation agreement across the smooth wood. His hands shook slightly, betraying the severe, agonizing panic hiding just beneath his tailored suit. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon his old commanding corporate voice, but it came out thin and reedy. He laid out his grand, delusional compromise. If I officially retracted my statements to the federal authorities, formally claimed the offshore transfers were a mutual marital misunderstanding, and signed away all my legal rights to the Seaside mansion and his remaining Vanguard assets, he would show my family mercy. He leaned forward, aiming a predatory, calculating glare directly at my aging parents. He arrogantly announced that he had recently uncovered a technical loophole regarding the predatory reverse mortgage he had secretly orchestrated on my parents' modest home months ago. If I refused his generous truce, he threatened to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. He explicitly promised to deliberately render my parents homeless within 30 days, liquidating their only remaining asset to pay for his mounting federal defense fees. He framed this vicious extortion as a benevolent sacrifice, graciously offering to spare my working-class family from absolute destitution in exchange for my total silence and absolute compliance. My mother gasped loudly, reaching out to clutch my father's arm in genuine, unadulterated terror. They had worked their entire lives to pay off that small house, and the prospect of losing it to my husband's vicious manipulation paralyzed them completely. Marcus smiled through his bruised face, sensing their overwhelming fear, fatally mistaking their vulnerability for his ultimate leverage. Sarah finally spoke, her voice laced with desperate, venomous urgency. She demanded I take the deal right now, insisting it was the only possible way I could save my pathetic family from living on the streets. They honestly believed they had cornered me. They truly thought cornering a senior forensic accountant with empty threats of financial ruin was a viable legal strategy. I looked at Marcus, then at Sarah, letting the silence stretch until the ambient ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. I slowly reached into my blazer pocket and retrieved my favorite silver fountain pen. The sharp click of the cap being removed echoed sharply in the cavernous room. My parents watched me, their eyes wide with silent pleading, terrified that I was actually submitting to his extortion. I smoothed the heavy parchment paper flat against the table. I did not hesitate, nor did I display a single ounce of fear. I pressed the silver nib to the signature line and signed my name with deliberate sweeping strokes. Marcus let out a ragged, audible sigh of relief, his shoulders instantly dropping as he believed he had successfully dodged a federal prison sentence. I placed the cap back on the pen, picked up the executed document, and slid it directly back across the table into his waiting hands. I leaned forward, resting my palms flat against the mahogany locking eyes with the man who had tried to destroy me. Read the fine print. Marcus lowered his bruised face toward the parchment, his bloodshot eyes scanning the dense typography. The arrogant smirk dissolved, sliding off his face like wet clay. His gaze darted frantically across the meticulously drafted paragraphs, searching for the standard divorce settlement clauses he had demanded. Instead, his eyes widened in horror as they locked onto the explicit language of a sworn criminal confession. The document detailed every facet of his illegal enterprise. It outlined the exact dates he forged digital signatures to secure fraudulent equity lines, the offshore routing numbers utilized to launder stolen capital, and the deeply buried instances of systematic medical malpractice committed to inflate his clinic's billing records. I had spent months gathering forensic evidence, and every irrefutable fact was now laid out in stark black and white, bound by a signature line he assumed represented his ultimate victory. The heavy silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering against the polished mahogany. He dropped the paper as if the fibers were searing his flesh, his breathing shallow and ragged. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her brow furrowed in confusion, before her own eyes tracked the damning text. The remaining color drained completely from her face, leaving her complexion a ghastly ashen gray. She stumbled backward, realizing instantly that they had attempted to extort a woman possessing enough verified evidence to bury them under a federal penitentiary. My parents sat perfectly still, the overwhelming terror that paralyzed them rapidly morphing into stunned, breathless awe. They watched as the oppressive power dynamic in the room inverted, with the force of a physical blow. The absolute silence in the formal dining room was heavy with the catastrophic weight of Marcus's total ruin. That fragile silence shattered violently. Marcus erupted with the unchecked fury of a cornered predator. He let out a guttural roar, kicking his dining chair backward so forcefully that it crashed to the floor, splintering the ornate wooden back against the wainscoting. He lunged across the wide table, his hands curling into white-knuckled fists, scattering crystal water glasses and sweeping the expensive floral centerpiece onto the rug. Saliva flew from his lips as he screamed obscenities, his face twisting into a grotesque mask of pure hatred. He threatened to tear my life apart, promising to unleash a wave of physical and financial destruction upon me. He slammed his fists against the mahogany wood, shouting that he would break every bone in my body if I did not immediately destroy the evidence of his financial crimes. I did not flinch. I did not lean back, nor did I break eye contact. I remained seated in absolute stillness, my posture radiating an icy calm that only seemed to fuel his escalating madness. My father, fueled by protective instinct, abruptly pushed his chair back and moved to intervene, placing his body between me and the unhinged man across the table. I simply raised my left hand, gesturing firmly for my father to stop and remain seated. I wanted Marcus to keep talking. I wanted him to exhaust every violent threat, every narcissistic demand, and every pathetic attempt at intimidation. I sat there and watched him completely unravel, analyzing his breakdown with the detached precision of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. He was no longer a respected medical professional. He was a desperate criminal clawing at the walls of a trap he built with his own arrogance. When his throat went raw and his shouting devolved into heavy, ragged panting, I slowly stood up from my chair. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer and offered him a smile devoid of any warmth. I raised my right hand and pointed a single finger toward the intricately carved crown molding in the upper corner of the dining room. Hidden seamlessly within the shadows of the vintage architectural details was a small, high-definition camera lens. I pivoted my finger, pointing to another identical lens, concealed behind the antique crystal chandelier, and a third, nestled within the bookshelf across the room. I let the visual confirmation sink into his panic-addled brain before I spoke, my voice echoing with quiet authority. I informed him that my security team had upgraded the mansion's internal surveillance system 3 days ago, installing state-of-the-art recording equipment throughout the entire first floor. I watched his eyes dart toward the ceiling, realization hitting him like a freight train. I explained that nothing happening in this room was being recorded to a local hard drive. The entire interaction from the moment he strutted through the front door was currently being live-streamed directly to an encrypted private server. I detailed how his explicit threats of physical violence, his brazen attempt to extort my parents using a fraudulently obtained reverse mortgage, and his panicked admission to the criminal confession document were flawlessly documented in high definition. The federal authorities already had undeniable proof of his wire fraud, but now they also possessed pristine evidence of witness intimidation, extortion, and terroristic threats. He had just handed the prosecution the final nails for his coffin. Marcus stood paralyzed, his chest heaving, as the inescapable reality crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. Sarah whimpered from the corner, sliding down the wall to sit rigidly on the floor, hands covering her face in defeat. There was no legal maneuver that could save them from the digital evidence currently sitting on a federal server. The suffocating silence was suddenly pierced by a sharp, rising sound in the distance. The wail of sirens echoed rapidly down the coastal highway, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. This was not the blare of local police cruisers responding to a domestic disturbance. The heavy rumble of powerful engines crunched aggressively onto the gravel driveway. I glanced out the large bay window, watching the reflection of flashing red and blue lights paint the manicured lawn. A massive caravan of sleek, armored black SUVs aggressively surrounded the perimeter of the Seaside mansion. Heavy tactical boots slammed against the pristine cobblestone pathway, shattering the suffocating silence of the formal dining room. The massive mahogany front doors were violently thrown open, rebounding off the foyer walls with an explosive, deafening crack. Over a dozen heavily armed federal agents poured into the opulent space, their dark tactical vests displaying bold yellow lettering. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, instantly securing every visible exit and establishing absolute control over the sprawling seaside estate. My parents shrank back into the ornate wallpaper, their eyes wide with sheer disbelief, as the overwhelming display of governmental power materialized right in front of them. Marcus and Sarah were completely surrounded before either of them could even attempt to stand up from the splintered wreckage of the dining chairs. The lead agent, a tall, uncompromising woman with eyes like chipped ice, marched directly to the head of the table. She did not raise her voice yet. Her command echoed with lethal authority, ordering everyone to keep their hands flat and visible on the polished wood. Marcus instinctively pivoted to his lifelong defense mechanism of wealthy white-collar entitlement. He abruptly straightened his ruined collar, forcing a grotesque, bruised smile onto his swollen face. He arrogantly demanded the lead agent's badge number, loudly proclaiming his status as a prominent, respected medical professional in the coastal community. He threatened to call the police commissioner, name-dropping local politicians, influential judges, and wealthy golf partners, as if those regional connections held any weight against a federal task force. He furiously insisted this was a massive, embarrassing bureaucratic mistake that would end the careers of everyone standing in his dining room. Beside him, Sarah immediately weaponized her tears. She collapsed onto her knees, sobbing hysterically and claiming she was simply an innocent bystander trapped in a terrifying domestic dispute. She gazed up at the tactical team through wet, fluttery eyelashes, performing a pathetic pantomime of a helpless victim. She begged them to let her leave, swearing she had absolutely no knowledge of any financial irregularities, forged property deeds, or offshore accounts. The lead federal agent did not even blink. She remained entirely impervious to Marcus's arrogant bluster and Sarah's theatrical manufactured distress. She sharply commanded Sarah to stand up and shut her mouth, utterly dismissing the fake tears with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The agent pulled a thick, tightly bound stack of legal documents from her tactical vest and slammed them down directly on top of Marcus's signed confession. She loudly announced the execution of a federal search and arrest warrant. She rattled off the charges with mechanical, devastating clarity: embezzlement, aggravated identity theft, interstate wire fraud, international money laundering, conspiracy to commit federal financial crimes. Each distinct charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence that promised to swallow the remainder of their adult lives. The agent explicitly noted the offshore transfers to the Cayman Islands and the fraudulent reverse mortgage paperwork, confirming that the FBI possessed undeniable, irrefutable proof of every single transgression. They had tracked every single digital footprint he thought he had hidden so cleverly. Barbara, who had been lingering in the adjacent sunroom, hoping to intervene in the mediation, stumbled into the dining room entryway. The color completely drained from her wrinkled face as she witnessed her precious, infallible golden child being physically restrained. The pristine, unblemished illusion of her superior social standing evaporated into thin air right before her terrified eyes. For decades, Barbara had relentlessly cultivated an image of absolute elitist perfection, using Marcus's medical degree and perceived wealth as a bludgeon to belittle everyone around her, especially me. Now she was forced to watch as federal agents roughly pulled his arms behind his back. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail, a sound born of pure, unadulterated social destruction. She realized instantly that the country club elite would feast on this humiliating spectacle. The local news vans would be parked outside her own home by dusk. Her friends would gleefully whisper about the disgraced doctor and his federal indictments over their afternoon martinis. Her entire world, built entirely on false prestige and arrogant comparisons, had just been burned to ash. She collapsed against the doorframe, clutching her chest, as the devastating reality of total public ruin finally registered in her mind. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Marcus's wrists echoed loudly throughout the dining room. Sarah shrieked as a second agent secured her wrists, roughly pulling her up from the floor. They were unceremoniously marched toward the front door, flanked by heavily armed personnel. The sheer humiliation of the perp walk completely shattered Marcus's remaining sanity. His tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat, his bruised face contorted into a mask of feral, desperate rage. As the agents dragged him past the exact spot where I stood, calmly observing the scene, he violently twisted his upper body, fighting hopelessly against the iron grip of his captors. His eyes burned with a manic, unhinged hatred, seeking a final, desperate emotional strike to salvage his obliterated ego before he was taken away forever. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with venomous fury. He yelled that I had won absolutely nothing today. He viciously screamed that I was a pathetic, empty woman who was nothing without him and his status. He loudly promised that I would die entirely alone, rotting away in meaningless solitude, without a successful husband to validate my miserable existence. He spat out utterly vile, pathetic, unforgivable curses, completely losing his fractured mind. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. Instead, I simply offered him a cold, victorious smile. I slowly raised my left arm, letting the ambient light catch the brilliant, polished face of my expensive designer watch. I adjusted the platinum strap with slow, deliberate, agonizing precision, ensuring he watched my absolute indifference to his childish tantrums. I'd rather be alone on my private beach than in federal prison with you. The flashing lights of the federal convoy disappeared down the winding coastal highway, leaving a profound, cleansing silence in their wake. I stood on the manicured lawn of my seaside estate, letting the cool, salty breeze wash over my face. The absolute destruction of Marcus and Sarah was complete, sealed by their own insurmountable arrogance. But the collateral damage of their financial syndicate was still settling across the elite social circles they once desperately sought to dominate. Barbara had collapsed onto the pristine cobblestones the exact moment the FBI agents shoved her golden child into the back of an armored SUV. She spent the next 3 weeks watching her meticulously curated reality disintegrate into absolute nothingness. The federal authorities methodically froze every single asset remotely tied to the Blackwell name, effectively starving her of the generational wealth she had relentlessly wielded like a weapon. Her prestigious Oak Haven Country Club membership, already permanently revoked during the violent Valet Circle brawl, became a glaring symbol of her sudden social leprosy. Her wealthy friends stopped answering her desperate daily calls. Her lifelong tennis partners immediately blocked her private number to avoid any collateral scandal. She was entirely ostracized, forced to helplessly witness her entire social empire crumble to ash, while her son awaited trial in a federal detention center. With her massive bank accounts completely drained by Marcus's aggressive white-collar defense attorneys and her platinum credit cards declining at the local grocery store, Barbara finally hit absolute rock bottom. The sheer terrifying desperation of impending homelessness ruthlessly stripped away the final remnants of her elite aristocratic pride. She had nowhere else to turn for salvation. It was a brilliantly sunny Tuesday afternoon when she finally arrived at my secure property gates. I was sitting on the wraparound mahogany porch, enjoying a perfectly steeped cup of Earl Grey tea with my mother Evelyn. We were quietly admiring the panoramic view of the sparkling Atlantic Ocean, savoring the absolute peace I had fought so fiercely to secure for our family. The heavy wrought iron security gate slowly swung open, authorized by my head of security. Barbara did not arrive in her usual chauffeured town car or a sleek luxury sedan. She stepped out of a battered yellow taxicab, her designer clothes looking distinctly unkempt and noticeably wrinkled. The severe, judgmental posture she had weaponized for a decade was entirely gone. She walked up the sweeping cobblestone driveway with a pronounced pathetic shuffle, her eyes completely downcast, utterly defeated by the crushing weight of her own shattered arrogance. She stopped at the bottom of the wide porch steps, staring up at me and my mother with wide, desperately frantic eyes. Barbara did not arrogantly demand entry into the mansion. She did not attempt to bark orders or establish any false sense of dominance. Instead, she fell to her knees on the bottom wooden step, bearing her heavily lined face in her trembling hands as loud, ragged sobs echoed across the serene wooden deck. She began a frantic, humiliating monologue, apologizing profusely for a decade of relentless disrespect and toxic behavior. She wept uncontrollably about how deeply she regretted severely underestimating me, claiming she had been entirely blinded by Marcus's manipulative sociopathic lies. She looked directly at my mother Evelyn, a strong woman she had spent years cruelly mocking for her working-class background, and shamelessly begged for maternal understanding and basic human compassion. Barbara clutched the painted wooden railing, her voice cracking violently as she pleaded for an immediate financial lifeline. She desperately swore that family urgently needed to stick together during times of catastrophic, unprecedented crisis. She eagerly promised to do absolutely anything if I would simply write her a substantial check to cover her rapidly mounting legal bills and basic daily living expenses. She rambled incessantly about the sheer indignity of facing eviction, sobbing that her advancing age made it fundamentally impossible for her to suddenly seek menial employment in the local workforce. She dramatically wiped her running mascara with the back of her wrist, leaving dark, ugly streaks across her previously flawless complexion. She wailed that she could not survive moving into a rented apartment after decades of absolute luxury. She reminded me over and over again that she was technically still my relative, attempting to evoke a non-existent familial bond to secure my endless financial patronage. She insisted that Marcus had always acted completely independently, aggressively, attempting to distance herself from his vast criminal enterprise to save her own sinking ship. It was a masterful, thoroughly pathetic display of weaponized vulnerability. A desperate final theatrical performance engineered solely to secure a temporary monetary bailout from the exact woman she had relentlessly sought to completely destroy. I calmly placed my delicate porcelain teacup onto the glass patio table, the sharp clink instantly breaking her hysterical, breathless monologue. I did not offer a comforting smile or a sympathetic nod. I stood up slowly from my comfortable wicker chair, ignoring her expectant gaze. I walked purposefully into the grand marble foyer, my heels clicking softly against the expensive tile. I returned a moment later carrying a heavy industrial plastic bucket filled with soapy water and a thick commercial-grade string mop. I walked steadily to the edge of the elevated porch, looking downward at the broken, weeping woman who had systematically tormented me for years. My incredible parents quietly looked on from their seats, their faces reflecting a lifetime of hard-earned, quiet dignity and profound resilience. I deliberately dropped the heavy bucket directly in front of her trembling hands, letting the sudsy water slosh aggressively onto the pristine wood. The harsh, jarring sound forced Barbara to finally stop crying and stare blankly at the cleaning supplies. I looked her dead in the eye, stripping away every single illusion she had left in this entire world. My parents worked cleaning houses for 30 years to put me through school while you mocked them. If you want to check, start with the guest bathrooms. Barbara stared at the heavy industrial mop, her perfectly manicured hands trembling with a mixture of profound humiliation and paralyzing disbelief. She opened her mouth to argue, to summon one last shred of her trademark elitist venom, but the cold, unforgiving reality of her complete destitution finally silenced her. Without another word, she turned on her ruined designer heels and shuffled back down the long gravel driveway toward the waiting taxicab. Her shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of absolute defeat. I watched the taillights disappear down the winding coastal highway, officially closing the chapter on the toxic dynasty that had tried to bury me. The ensuing months transformed into a relentless high-stakes legal battlefield. The federal prosecution moved with terrifying surgical efficiency, armed with the pristine digital evidence I had meticulously handed them. The courtroom became my stage, and I attended every single hearing, sitting impeccably dressed in the front row. I watched Marcus attempt to deploy his usual arrogant charm on the federal judge, a fatal miscalculation that only deepened his inevitable catastrophic ruin. The trial was a rapid, brutal dismantling of his entire existence. The prosecution played the high-definition video from the dining room in open court, broadcasting his unhinged violent threats and explicit financial confessions to a packed, gasping gallery. His high-priced defense attorneys, realizing they were defending a rapidly sinking ship, desperately tried to negotiate a last-minute plea deal, but the district attorney refused to show a single ounce of leniency. When the final gavel slammed down, the echoing crack sounded like pure, unadulterated justice. The state medical board permanently revoked his license, completely stripping him of the prestigious title he had hidden behind for decades to abuse others. The federal judge looked down from the bench with absolute disgust, sentencing him to a mandatory 5 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. As the bailiffs forcefully escorted him out of the courtroom in a bright orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled to his waist, his eyes met mine one last time. There was no rage left in his expression, only the hollow, terrified realization that he was entirely powerless and completely forgotten. Sarah's fate was equally devastating and thoroughly public. The federal investigation tore through her family's financial records like a Category 5 hurricane, exposing years of complicit involvement in Marcus's offshore laundering schemes. The IRS seized their primary sprawling estate, froze their lucrative luxury investment portfolios, and aggressively audited their remaining business holdings. The once untouchable arrogant socialites were reduced to absolute grinding bankruptcy within a matter of weeks. They were forced to watch helplessly as repo men hauled away their imported luxury vehicles and government agents cataloged their extensive collection of fine art to cover the crippling legal penalties and massive outstanding restitution orders. The country club elite, the exact same superficial people who had eagerly attended their extravagant summer galas, immediately ostracized them, treating their disgraced name like a highly contagious disease. They vanished from the coastal community, entirely retreating into a quiet, humiliating obscurity that they had always mercilessly mocked others for enduring. With the criminals officially locked away and their enablers financially ruined, I turned my full attention toward completely securing my family's future. My first priority was aggressively dismantling the predatory reverse mortgage Marcus had deceitfully orchestrated on my parents' modest home. Working alongside top-tier ruthless real estate attorneys, I provided the undeniable concrete proof of his digital forgery and financial coercion. The bank had no choice but to immediately nullify the fraudulent contract, officially clearing the title and restoring my parents' absolute unencumbered ownership of their beloved house. But that was merely the beginning of their reward. I officially transferred the deed of the sprawling seaside mansion into a heavily protected ironclad generational trust. I handed my mother and father the heavy brass keys to the coastal property, explicitly ensuring they would spend their retirement surrounded by absolute breathtaking luxury, utterly untouchable by anyone's greed. They wept as they walked through the grand marble foyer, running their hands over the mahogany banisters, not out of fear, but out of profound, overwhelming joy. The house that had once served as a monument to Marcus's toxic ego was now a permanent, beautiful sanctuary for the two hardest working people I knew. 1 year later, the glittering, cavernous ballroom of the Plaza Hotel hummed with the electric energy of the city's corporate elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of prominent executives, influential investors, and powerful legal minds gathered for the annual industry gala. I stood backstage, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored emerald gown, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of my own heartbeat. Tonight was not just a celebration, it was a definitive coronation. The managing director of my firm stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to silence the booming applause. He spoke passionately about dedication, flawless forensic accounting, and unparalleled professional integrity. Then his voice echoed clearly across the silent ballroom, officially announcing my promotion to senior partner. The applause was deafening as I walked out into the blinding spotlight, the rapid flash of cameras capturing my absolute triumph. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out over the sea of powerful faces, and I smiled. I did not deliver a generic tearful speech about surviving hardship or enduring emotional trauma. I gripped the sides of the podium and spoke with lethal, unapologetic confidence. I spoke about the undeniable power of tactical precision. I detailed the exact art of letting arrogant, toxic people blindly underestimate you while you methodically dismantle their carefully constructed reality from the inside out. I told the hushed crowd that true power is never loud, never frantic, and never requires empty emotional threats. True power is waiting in absolute silence, armed with irrefutable facts, and letting your enemies eagerly sign their own confessions. As the entire ballroom erupted into a massive standing ovation, I raised my glass, toasting to a beautiful permanent victory. The reverberations of that applause faded into the steady, rhythmic crashing of ocean waves against the shoreline, bringing me forward to a crisp, beautifully clear Thanksgiving afternoon, exactly 1 year later. The expansive seaside mansion, once a suffocating monument to Marcus's fragile ego and Sarah's hollow elitism, had been entirely transformed into a beacon of warmth and absolute tranquility. I stood on the sprawling wraparound balcony, leaning against the polished mahogany railing and letting the cool, salt-tinged autumn breeze wash over my face. The oppressive toxic energy that had previously stained every single square inch of this coastal property was entirely eradicated. It was seamlessly replaced by the rich, inviting aromas of roasted turkey, fresh sage, and cinnamon drifting effortlessly through the open French doors. There were no tense, calculating whispers echoing in the grand hallways, no frantic attempts to appease a raging narcissist, and absolutely no performative socialites judging the thread count of the table linens. We had meticulously replaced the suffocating illusion of elite perfection with the genuine, unshakable reality of peace. Today was a celebration of survival resilience and the sheer, unadulterated joy of completely reclaiming our stolen lives. My parents sat comfortably at the massive outdoor dining table, their faces radiating a profound, youthful vitality I had not witnessed in over a decade. My mother Evelyn laughed brightly as she poured a deep red Pinot Noir for my closest colleagues and the genuinely supportive friends who had stood fiercely by my side during the darkest days of the federal investigation. She wore a stunning cashmere sweater, her shoulders completely relaxed, utterly devoid of the paralyzing anxiety that had once defined her interactions within these walls. My father sat beside her effortlessly carving the golden turkey with a steady, confident hand, swapping light-hearted stories with my business partners. They were the absolute picture of peaceful, luxurious retirement, thriving in a sanctuary secured by the very same ironclad generational trust that permanently blocked any future predators from threatening their financial stability. I watched them thrive in this opulent environment, feeling a deep, resonating satisfaction that far outweighed any professional accolade or corporate promotion. We had meticulously curated our own chosen family, entirely eliminating the parasitic individuals who had previously attempted to drain our resources and systematically destroy our fundamental sense of self-worth. Inside the adjacent living room, the massive flat-screen television hummed softly in the background, tuned to the local afternoon news broadcast. The polished anchor's voice drifted through the open doors, carrying a story that I had personally orchestrated with ruthless, calculated precision over the past 8 months. The camera panned across a bustling construction site, located squarely in the heart of the city's commercial district. Heavy yellow bulldozers and massive hydraulic excavators roared into action, methodically tearing down the sleek, modern glass facade of Marcus's former luxury dental clinic. The building, which had served as the primary epicenter for his rampant medical malpractice and aggressive insurance fraud, was being brutally reduced to a spectacular mountain of shattered glass and twisted steel rebar. Plumes of gray dust billowed into the autumn sky as the heavy machinery crushed the expensive marble reception area, where Sarah had once sat, looking down her nose at the working-class patients they were actively extorting. The live destruction of his criminal empire was a mesmerizing visual symphony of absolute poetic justice, playing out on high-definition television for the entire coastal community to witness firsthand. The news anchor seamlessly transitioned the segment, brightly announcing that the demolished lot had been purchased at a federal asset forfeiture auction by an anonymous corporate entity. She enthusiastically reported that the prime commercial real estate was being entirely redeveloped into a state-of-the-art community center designed specifically to offer free financial literacy programs and comprehensive legal aid clinics for vulnerable working-class families. She praised the massive philanthropic investment, completely unaware that the funding originated directly from the secure, highly diversified limited liability company I had quietly established following my promotion to senior partner. I watched the heavy iron wrecking ball smash through the remaining load bearing walls of Marcus's disgraced clinic, knowing that he was currently sitting in a sterile concrete federal penitentiary cell, stripped of his medical license, his offshore accounts, and his precious freedom. He would likely see the exact same broadcast from the prison common room, forced to watch his grand narcissistic legacy being literally pulverized into dust and repurposed to empower the exact demographic of people he had spent his entire pathetic life viciously mocking and attempting to financially destroy. I turned my gaze away from the television screen, letting the satisfying noise of the demolition fade back into the ambient, joyful chatter of my Thanksgiving guests. The late afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting brilliant streaks of gold and deep violet across the churning surface of the ocean. My father wiped his hands on a linen napkin, gently excusing himself from the lively conversation at the dining table. He walked over to the edge of the balcony where I stood holding two tall, elegant crystal flutes filled to the brim with expensive, perfectly chilled champagne. He handed one of the delicate glasses to me, his eyes crinkling at the corners with immense overflowing pride. He looked out over the sprawling private beach, then turned to look back at the warm, glowing interior of the mansion, filled with the people who truly mattered. He gently clinked his glass against mine, the high, clear chime ringing perfectly in the crisp coastal air. He smiled warmly, his voice thick with profound, boundless gratitude and absolute, unshakable respect. "You protected our family, Chloe. You saved us from absolute ruin when nobody else would even dare to try." I took a slow, deliberate sip of the crisp champagne, smiling back at him, as the ultimate picture of success, total independence, and sweet, deeply calculated revenge. "No, Dad. I just finally took out the trash forever."